Make friends for yourself with dishonest wealth. Now, doesn't that sound more like advice that's been taken a little too much to heart by some politicians and not anything like what you would expect Jesus to say? This is probably one of the trickiest of Jesus's parables, probably the trickiest, because the hero is actually a villain and Jesus seems to be saying that he did the right thing. Now, what I love about this is that just when we think we've got Jesus figured out, and just when we think we understand what's going on in the parables, this story comes along and we're thrown back into confusion, which is, after all, the natural state of anyone seeking to understand Jesus and live well in the world. This story trips us up and makes us question what we thought we knew. And that is exactly what the parables are supposed to do. We have managed to domesticate most of Jesus' stories and inoculate ourselves against their challenges, but this one refuses to be domesticated. You see, the parable of the prodigal son would have been just as shocking for the first hearers. A young man grievously dishonors his father and rejects his family's moral standards. And Jesus seems to let him off the hook. His hearers would have been furious. But familiarity has softened the impact of that story for us. But this parable of the dishonest manager is less familiar, and probably, it's less familiar, and that's probably because a lot of preachers will do anything to avoid preaching on it. So it has not been softened and domesticated by thousands of sermons and has kept its ability to shock and scandalize. This is the story of a man who found himself in an impossible situation. His situation was impossible for all sorts of reasons. It was impossible because he was not just losing his job, he was losing his capacity to work. He would never be trusted as a manager again now that he had been exposed as an embezzler, and he had no other way to make a living. His situation was also impossible because his patron, the person who would have given him all of his opportunities in life, is the person who he has defrauded. So he can't expect a lot more help there. And on top of all that, his situation was impossible because it was his own fault. He couldn't blame anyone else or expect anyone else to take responsibility for fixing the problem. He had dug himself into this hole, and no one but himself is going to get him out. This is not a story about a good person who falls into hardship. It is kind of like the story of the prodigal son in that way, about someone whose hardship has been created by his own greed and dishonesty and stupidity. This guy was a scumbag, but we can still feel for him, can't we? Because on occasion we have all dug ourselves into holes we can't get out of. Not just individually, but corporately. As we reflect this month in the season of creation on humanity's role as God's image bearers and co-workers in creation, and as we see the pollution of waterways and the extinction of species, and as we grapple with predictions of increasing climate instability, and particularly as we listen to the distress of young people who are terrified about the future and disillusioned with adults and especially with politicians, it's easy to lose hope. It can feel like an impossible situation. Impossible because we only have one planet. We have nowhere else to go. Impossible because, like the dishonest manager, the situation is largely our own doing. We can't blame anyone else or expect anyone else to fix it. We feel the depth of despair of the words from the Jeremiah reading this morning. The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. So we can feel for the man in the story, can't we? But in his impossible situation, he had one thing going for him. Everything else was stripped away, but he had one resource left. He was clever. And so, just as he was thinking he had run out of options, his resourceful mind presented him with a plan. The one plan that just might work. To understand what he did next, we need to know a little bit about business practices of his day. Some things that the original hearers would have taken for granted, but we need to understand. First, this was long before computers and even long before banks as we know them began. So when someone owed someone else money, the document, the paper documenting the debt was written in the handwriting of the debtor and stored with the creditor. That way neither side could easily falsify the document. That's why our hero calls the debtors in to change the entry. It had to be in their handwriting. We also need to know that the quantities we're talking about here are enormous. Ordinary people couldn't owe these amounts. These are the sort of debts that only filthy rich people could afford. And finally, we need to know that creditors in that time, as in every time, were pretty keen about getting their money back. But their managers had some discretion to reduce debts in the event of a natural disaster. Putting all that together, we can see that our villainous hero calls in some of his master's wealthiest clients and has conversations with them that may have gone a bit like this. Oh, I was so sorry to hear about that fire that went through your estate last month. What fire? Shh, you remember the fire, the one that lets me reduce your debt by half. Oh, that fire. And then the next client. It was such a pity about that locust plague that devoured your crops. What locust plague? Shh. You remember the locust plague, the one that means I can reduce your debt by 25%. Oh, yes, I remember now. And so on. You get the point. He did this because he lived in a culture with a very strong sense of reciprocity. Reciprocity means that if I do you a good turn, then you are obliged to do me a good turn. This unemployable manager will now be able to go to each of those clients in turn and say, remember how I saved you all that money? Well, as it happens, I need a place to stay for the next couple of years. You don't mind giving me a bed, do you? Since we're such good friends. And so he has a roof over his head and food in his tummy for the rest of his life. In a seemingly impossible situation, he managed to recognize and seize the one opportunity that was there for him. And even his old boss, who he had ripped off, says, wow, that was clever. It isn't that he did the right thing. He had left the right thing behind years ago. He did the clever thing. And Jesus encourages his disciples to do the clever thing. As we face environmental crisis, we could give up. We could say it's all too hard. Or we could use our heads. We can be clever. We can find one thing that we can do and do it boldly. My daughter grew up with deep climate anxiety. I did my best not to feed her anxiety. In fact, as I look back, I think I paid less attention to climate science than I should have, because I didn't want my anxiety to feed hers. But she knew better. And in this, as in so many ways, my children became my teachers. She knew instinctively that the best response to anxiety is not denial, but action. She is now in her 20s and has begun a PhD in marine ecology in order to be equipped to make a difference. She is doing the one thing that she can do. What is the one thing you could do towards healing our traumatized planet? Or maybe there's lots of little tiny things. We need to use whatever resources we have at hand to make whatever small differences we can. So, as a standalone story, this parable has a powerful message. Find the one thing you can do and do that. Be clever about it. But what Luke does next is to give it an extra sting in its tail. This villainous hero of this story gave money to rich people so they would welcome him into their homes when he became homeless. Sucking up to wealthy people is a practice that has made sense in every culture throughout history. And to our shame, that includes church cultures. Jesus tells his disciples to do the same, to make friends using money so that those friends will welcome us into homes that will last. The question posed by this parable and by Jesus's comment on it is this. Now, very crassly, who do we need to bribe to get the best spots in heaven? Now, I know it's shocking to put the question that way, but Luke wants us to be shocked. Jesus wants us to be shocked. If we keep reading just past where this morning's reading finishes, we find a story that answers that question decisively. And we'll get there next week. It's the parable of the rich man and the homeless beggar. The Gospels were not written to be read in little chunks the way we do. And by doing this, we run the risk of missing the big picture. It is essential that we read these two stories together. Excuse me. If we are clever, Jesus is saying, we will bribe homeless people in order to get the best spots in heaven. We should be sucking up to people who are poor and destitute, because those people who are least now will be first in God's kingdom. Clever people will use their money to buy the influence of those who in this life have absolutely nothing to give, but in the kingdom of God are the influences. And as we think about this upside down wisdom during the season of creation, perhaps we might consider giving support to those who are most devastated by climate change, those who are most vulnerable and least able to adapt. That might include people in the Pacific Islands whose homes are sinking. It definitely includes the victims of fire and flood in Australia and around the world, in Pakistan right now. We are called to work for the welfare of those who are most vulnerable and under-resourced, those who are least likely to repay us in this life, but who are way ahead of us in God's kingdom. And we might include non-human species who are barely holding on and have nothing to give us back but their tenacious existence. In the face of our impossible situations, what might clever people do? They would use their heads and find the one plan that might just work and then follow that plan boldly. And that plan should include giving away our resources to those who are suffering the most. Not just because that's the nice thing to do, the kind thing to do, but because it is the clever thing to do. Because we believe Jesus when he says that those who are least now will be the people of the most influence in God's kingdom. So let's be a parish that makes lots of genuinely influential friends. The Lord be with you. Amen.